皆さん、こんにちは。
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As I've been kindly introduced, my name is Kudo. I'm the president of Gendon NPO. I am so delighted to have a big turnout for this the conference. We have 17 the experts from United States, from China, from ROK, and Japan. And we have now launched the Asia Peace Conference, which is quite relevant to this region. Northeastern region is the most unstable region in the world right now. Not only for the peace today, but we would like to go for sustainable peace in the future. The multilateral forum for the first time, albeit on a private sector basis, for the first time that we have seen such a mechanism reality. There are many hotspots and the potential the breakout of different conflicts. We don't see stable bilateral relationship in many ways. There are 10 risks threatening the peace in Northeast Asia, which is the document which we have put forward. We have actually asked 2,000 experts, and 308 of them have actually responded. And we have asked 25 the authorities also the same the questions, and the peace the risk. We have asked rather 12 to start with. And on the first page, I believe you are able to see the North Korean is given at the top of the list. And we have in many ways allusion to the U.S.-China relationship, and also Japan-Korea, the rivalry, and also Taiwan that's been given as a risky issue. So we have selected 10 the major potential the risks, and looking at these the risks, especially what the top experts are responding. In the 2020, these are the risks that could occur and erupt for many different items. So the Northeast Asia region seems to be in a highly dangerous situation right now. We don't have sufficient solutions to various issues, and we are asked to address many different challenges. And we don't have, nonetheless, a multilateral forum or mechanism to discuss all these issues. We have prepared for the past 6 years, and at last, between Japan and China, Japan and ROK, and Japan-United States, we have had many dialogues and conversations between amongst us. We have at last launched this Asia Peace Conference. At the closed session this morning from 9:30, we need to prevent any conflicts to happen on an unexpected basis. And we need to think about the structure so that there will be no escalation or the further enlargement of any the conflict or the possible rivalry between or amongst the different countries. And we have discussed duly. And for now, we will start out on a bilateral basis, but we would like to have a legal binding mechanism to create it to prevent any the conflicts to happen and so forth. But we also need to have regular review on such a basic mechanism and eventually create a region-wide mechanism. And that is what we have been discussing so far. And as you can see at your hand, a consensus the document that has been distributed to you. I hope that you will be able to read the document at your leisure later. Japan, U.S., China, and ROK have different concepts, especially because of the rivalry between the U.S. and China. There are many, many issues involved. But thinking about the future framework, before making this happen, what are the principles that we need to establish in order to bring forth the peace in this region? And we have agreed on 3 topics: no war to be engaged, and anti-hegemony, never to oppress the others, and also rule of law. Those are the 3 principles that we have been able to see consensus on. And by establishing the 3 principles, at least initially with 4 countries coming together to work for or eventually a mechanism to be created. So we will be stepping forward for the lasting peace in the future. And that was what we have been discussing this morning, which is the valuable the meeting. And what has triggered us for the 4 countries to come together in a dialogue? In 2013, because of the Senkaku Islands that issue, there has been a very difficult, tensive situation seen between Japan and China. And the media at large has been saying that conflict could occur in this region. And we were not able to see a foreign policy or diplomacy. So in 2013, we went to China, and we have made public the pledge of no war. And at the background of this was not just on bilateral basis, but that this no war pledge should be eventually spread to the whole of Northeast Asia. And China and Japan have agreed to work for this purpose. And we have been trying hard, but the circumstances were so difficult. It was not easy. Various bilateral relations have deteriorated. Japan-China and Japan-ROK, and with North Korean making provocations, the critical situation have arose. And we had to make haste to proceed forward with our preparation. I have counted more than 20 times we have come together to have a debate, those 4 the countries. Now, we are a private sector, not the government, the level. The reason for private sector to be active in playing a role, I think there's a special role to be played by us. What the government should do, we, the private sector, will take the initiative so that we will move forward 1 step or even just a half step forward in advance of the government. So as we have put through with the no war pledge, as we see very dangerous situation in Northeast Asia, we would like to create a foundation for peace in the region. And solidly, we have made 1 step forward by launching this Asia Peace Conference. But because we are on a private sector basis, the biggest weapon for us would be we would have the public opinion behind us, all the peoples of the region supporting us with 1 voice to create peace in this region. When do we see that voice coming forward? I believe we will be able to move the whole world. And I am convinced that we could make this happen, because for the past several years, between Japan and China, and between Japan and ROK, and between Japan and the United States, we have made public the opinion poll, the survey results. We are the only one who are able to make public the opinion poll, the survey done in China. On a bilateral basis, we do have certain threat perception militarily. That is true. But on the other hand, we need to cooperate with each other closely to create a mechanism for peace. More than half of the people say that we need to have a confidence-building mechanism on a multilateral basis. So there are different voices asking for this to happen. And what we have found was majority of the peoples wanted to see no war to happen in this region. And based upon this survey, we have come forward with the no war pledge and anti-hegemony and the rule of law to be established. So at least for the 4 countries, we will be able to work closely together to move forward. There has been different voices heard and different opinions being heard. There has been disagreements as well in the closed session, but nobody said no to these 3 principles. For the definition of the different the words and terminology, there were different interpretations and difference in views. That is true, but nonetheless, we would like to go forward. The multilateral forum like this, I believe this is the first in the region, but we will have this dialogue once every year at least, not just on a multilateral basis, but we would also accumulate bilateral basis dialogue. Japan, US, Japan, ROK, Japan, China, and so forth. And we would like to appeal to the citizens at large so that we will have a very firm resolve to move toward peace. So today is invaluable opportunity for us. So we have the many experts who have joined us during the closed session this morning. Many of them have remained to participate in this forum as well. How can we be able to realize sustained peace in Northeast Asia? That would be the very topic we would like to discuss today. Thank you very much once again for coming to this conference. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Next, for another opening remark, we have with us Mr. Gen Nakatani, former Minister of Defense and member of the House of Representatives. Please take the floor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Nakatani Gen. 10 years ago, at the Diet, when the security legislation was deliberated, I was the then Minister for Defense. For risk avoidance in Northeast Asia, the consensus was adopted, which includes crisis management mechanism and the framework to begin the task for peace and stability. Congratulations. In 2005, the first Tokyo-Beijing Forum was held. In 2013, the first Japan-Korea Future Dialogue was launched, and 7 years have passed. It's 15 years since the inaugural Tokyo-Beijing Forum. During this period, Senkaku conflict, non-war pledge, and DPRK consultations were conducted, and I was told that 6 years have been spent for the preparation for this conference. Through this forum, a common set of values shall be generated. Peace principle based upon anti-hegemony, anti-belligerence, rule of law, and mutual respect for sovereignty and territory is wonderful, and I would like to commend the great efforts made to start this effort up. I truly hope that this conference will be continued and further developed. This will be a stage for confidence building in Northeast Asia, and by praying that there would be further progress made, I would like to conclude my words of greeting. I'm sure that consultations will continue through this conference. Again, thank you for your kind attention.
中谷様、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Mr. Nakatani. Mr. Nakatani will join us for the second session later on. So, without further ado, let us begin our first session. Let me introduce the representatives of the 4 countries. So we will have a total of 10. Starting from your right, we have from China 2 panelists, distinguished panelists. We have Zhang Yuling, Academy member of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Sitting right next to him is Director of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies, Mr. Zhang Zushen. From the United States, we have 2 distinguished panelists. We have Mr. Ralph Kosa, President Emeritus, and WSD Handa Chair in Peace Studies Pacific Forum. And Ambassador David Shea, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. From ROK, we have 2 distinguished panelists. First Deputy Director of the National Security Office and Secretary General of the National Security Council, Mr. Li Sancho. Right next to him is Mr. Choi Gan, Vice President at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Last but not least, I would like to introduce to you our distinguished panelists representing Japan. Professor Akio Takahara, Professor of Contemporary Chinese Politics at the Graduate School of Law and Politics and Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, and Mr. Katsutoshi Kawano, former Chief of Staff, the Japan Self-Defense Forces, and Mr. Yoji Koda, former Commander-in-Chief, the Self-Defense Fleet. Thank you all for coming. And this first session will be moderated by Mr. Yasushi Kudo, President of Gendon NPO. Over to you.
では始めさせていただきます。
So let us begin. We have 1 hour and 15 minutes for this session, right? So it is not that long. So we should move on efficiently. For this session, although we have had a different debate and discussion, we need to identify the threat to start with in the Northeast Asia. How do each of the 4 countries view the threat in this region? For the Japanese experts and the Japanese eminent persons, as they perceive in the year 2020 as threats in the year 2020 in this Northeast region, which could come forward. North Korea, and also U.S. to China rivalry, and also what would happen with the U.S. presidential election. And this is also thought to be a threat to this region. 6.71 is the score given to this. And then the behavior of China in South China Sea, and the Chinese military capability increasing 6.25, and Hong Kong 5.33, and Taiwan, as well as the cyber and the space. And also Japan and the ROK rivalry, and the U.S. The ROC alliance or the cooperation, and also Xi Jinping's visit to Japan. I don't understand why this is to be negative, but I believe this is being thought in the line of Sino-U.S. rivalry. And then the next that comes forward, I wanted to be included in the top 10, but I couldn't do that. I couldn't do something unjust. But the climate change issue was also mentioned, 11th and the 12th, the proliferation of nuclear, and as INF, that is what happened. So 5 minutes each. I would like to ask the most dependable person to start with, Admiral Koda, representing Japan, please.
Koda
speaking. As factors of crisis, 12 elements were cited, but if we look at the situation from a slightly different angle, national strength, if we measure by economy, U.S. comes number 1, second comes China, and then Japan is the third, and ROK is the 13th in terms of the ranking of participating countries. And you would be surprised to hear the comparison of military strength. There are several yardsticks, but in the world, there are a few dedicated think tanks who do comparative study of military strength. And I took the average of the 4 indicators first, and this includes nuclear. First comes United States, second, China, third, Russia, fourth, India, fifth, France, sixth, UK, seventh, Japan, eighth, Germany, ninth, Turkey, 10th, Italy, 11th, ROK, 12th, Taiwan, which means that beyond Europe, countries with higher military might are gathered in this region, higher than Europe. And in that context, US, China, and Russia are nuclear nations. DPRK is highly likely to become one. So in this context, how do we interpret the factors just cited by President Kudo, which is a very important subject? And here, when we just look at the threats, there could be a separate matrix. For example, geopolitically, North Korea, China, from Japan and US perspective, they are on the eastern side of the Eurasian continent, facing the East and South China Seas. China, North Korea, ROK, US, and Japan. How can we collaborate between ROK, China, and Japan vis-a-vis North Korea? I'm waiting for the translation to be completed. And then technically, as was mentioned, cyber, outer space, or submarine optical fiber network, internet connectivity. These factors are intrinsically related to military might and economic power. So if we take in all these factors together, how do we evaluate the threats and try to diffuse tension? If I may deviate a bit, it's 12 years since I retired, but last week I was in Washington to attend the annual meeting of the U.S. Navy, and I returned on Sunday to Japan. But U.S. forces, high-end war is being taken into consideration. During the Cold War period, USSR and the United States confronted against each other, and they are putting that as the centerpiece in their considerations. And as one factor of that study, cyber exists. Then do we have the brains to do that? In fact, we've experienced two things when it comes to likelihood of war. Powers unintentionally, accidentally meet against each other as an incident. 2001, China, Hainan Island, P-3 and J-11 of the Chinese forces clashed. And what happened at that time of the collision? Another point, DPRK boldly decided in 2011 the bombing of the Cheongnam or Yongbyon bombardment. That caused a flashpoint, and that was well controlled by the wisdom of South Korea. So they could be great lessons and food for thought as we develop our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, let me turn to the United States. Ambassador David Scheer, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kudo. I was asked to discuss three threats to stability in the region, but I'm going to discuss four, and I'm going to start by saying that I think the U.S.-China relationship is probably an increasing source of risk and uncertainty in the region. The United States and China last week arrived at a Phase 1 trade deal, and I think we can all take heart in that and hope that on that basis we can build a stronger relationship, both country to country, and a stronger relationship between our two leaders, President Trump and President Xi. However, I don't think we can be complacent. Strategic distrust between the United States and China is increasing, and that, of course, threatens regional peace and stability over the long term. What are the components of this strategic distrust? Well, for example, I think many Americans think the Chinese want to diminish our alliances and ultimately drive us from the region. I think many Chinese feel that the United States seeks to contain Chinese power. I think many Americans believe that the Chinese seek to establish economic hegemony in East Asia via mercantile means, and I think many Chinese believe that Americans want to prevent China from developing further economically and technologically. So those are just a couple of examples of the sources of strategic mistrust. I think in the short to medium term, the single thing, most important thing the United States and China can do to manage strategic distrust and manage many of the differences we have over hotspot issues in the region is for them to cultivate the closest possible, strongest possible communications at the senior-most levels. Senior communications between, senior contacts between the U.S. and China have been sporadic for the past couple of years. I think they need to be much more frequent, much more regular, and that includes contacts between President Trump and President Xi, as well as contacts between our defense and foreign ministers. I think the United States and China also need to continue developing our military-to-military contacts as a way of reducing risk and increasing confidence between our militaries. The United States and China have cut back to some extent on our military-to-military contacts, but we've continued to stress the importance of contacts that reduce risk and increase transparency. That includes the defense consultative talks. It includes the military maritime consultative agreement talks. Just recently, the U.S. Army sponsored a bilateral humanitarian and disaster relief exercise in Hawaii that I think was quite successful. So despite the negative trends in U.S.-China relations, we can hope that military-to-military contacts will continue and that we will continue to look for ways of reducing risk and managing the risk of war. A second risk in the region, of course, is North Korea. And I touched on this yesterday, but Kim Jong-un, in a speech at the end of last year, indicated that he is no longer bound by the freeze on nuclear and missile testing. He has threatened to reveal a new strategic weapon, and he has called upon his people to buckle down for the long term. I think the single thing that we can do in the short term to reduce risk on the Korean Peninsula is to restore the six-party talks, or at least the six parties minus North Korea. And I think those parties should stress our continued commitment to sanctions on North Korea, as well as our interest in continuing negotiations between the U.S. and North Korea. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un should continue the freeze on missile and nuclear testing. He should continue, and the U.S. and the ROK should continue the freeze on exercises. A third risk to the region, I think, is the potential instability across the Taiwan Strait. Of course, we saw recently the election victory of President Tsai Ing-wen. I think this must worry the Chinese. I think the United States, Japan, and China need to recommit to observing the normalization communiques. I think we all need to show restraint as President Tsai and China seek ways of, hopefully seek ways of restoring interaction between the mainland and Taiwan. And I think the United States and Japan need to maintain deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. Finally, there's the East China Sea, where Chinese incursions into Japanese claimed territory around the Senkakus have increased. And I think that that situation could be stabilized further with stronger risk reduction measures between Japan and China. I think generally in Northeast Asia, where ROK, Chinese, Japanese, and the U.S. Navy all interact, it would be useful for us not only to look at bilateral means of reducing risk and increasing confidence, but multilateral means as well.
はい。はい、どうもありがとう。
Thank you very much. Not only in terms of recognition of a crisis, thank you very much for covering how to respond possibly to the crisis. You talk about Japan, China, South Korea, and of those, two relates to China. So, Mr. Zhang and Shan, what are some of the risks that concerns you this year?
I'd like to share with you the Chinese scholars' viewpoints about what we should do to prevent a possible war in Northeast Asia. A hot war in East Asia is unlikely, but it cannot be completely ruled out. For years, the biggest risk has been the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait. The security friction between China and the US in the South China Sea is also at great risk because of frequent encounters between military aircrafts and the warships of the two sides. After the three great risks, the risks on cybersecurity could rank fourth, which is new and rising security risks. Of course, all these risks under the shadow of deteriorated China-US relations. To prevent war on the Korean Peninsula, the most important thing is to realize the denuclearization of the peninsula and turn the armistice mechanism into a peace mechanism. At present, the East Asia countries should promote the US and the DPRK to break the deadlock and make the talk in progress. Otherwise, the window of opportunity may close again. At present, China and Russia have co-sponsored the draft solution in the UN Security Council on the political settlement of the Korean Peninsula issue, which covers 4 points. One is to resume the six-party talks. So I hope all the parties concerned to support this joint proposal. To prevent the outbreak of a military conflict or war across Taiwan Straits, the key is to safeguard the framework of one China and resolutely oppose Taiwan independence. Since 2016, the Taiwan independence forces have once again come to power in Taiwan and denied the 1992 consensus. In addition, since the Trump administration came to power, it has taken many wrong actions that violate the one China policy. In result, the trend of peaceful development across the Taiwan Strait since 2008 has been undermined, and the situation across the Taiwan Straits has deteriorated again. Under the new circumstances, China will not change its basic policy, will continue to strive for peaceful reunification. But if the Taiwan independence forces or some foreign forces insist on separating Taiwan from China, the Chinese government will be forced to resort to non-peaceful means. This was clearly stipulated in the anti-secession law published in 2005. China sincerely hopes that the US, Japan, and South Korea, as well as the international community, will adhere to the one China policy, which is of great significance in preventing war across Taiwan Strait. As for the dispute over sovereignty and the maritime rights and interests in the East Asia, I think all parties to the disputes have opposed the use of force in resolving the disputes. So I don't think the dispute over sovereignty and the maritime rights in the region will lead to military conflict and war. Nevertheless, efforts must be made to prevent the contingencies. To this end, more efforts should be made to establish and strengthen crisis management mechanisms, security codes of conduct, and various CBMs. Now, China is negotiating a COC with ASEAN to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea. In the East China Sea, the three disputable countries of China, Japan, and South Korea should formulate bilateral COC similar to the INCSI and the China-American CBM memorandums, a memorandum on the basis of adherence to the cues passed by the Western Pacific Naval Symposium in 2014. There is no sovereignty and maritime rights and interest dispute between China and the United States in the South China Sea, but there are frictions over geopolitics over there. Now, both sides hope to strengthen risks and crisis management. To this end, both militaries should earnestly implement the two CBM memoranda. In addition, the two sides need to engage in serious strategic dialogue to reach agreement on avoiding militarization of the South China Sea and jointly maintaining the security and the smooth flow of the sea lanes of communication in the South China Sea. In recent years, risks on cybersecurity are rising, but there is a serious lack of international rules and laws in this area. China, the United States, Japan, and ROK should conduct bilateral and multilateral cybersecurity dialogues as soon as possible, strengthen rule building and manage cybersecurity risks. In this regard, Asia-Pacific Conference can play a positive pathfinding role. I'll stop here.
はい、ありがとうございました。じゃあ、韓国のイ・サンチュルさん。
Very much. Thank you very much. Then could we ask Mr. Lee San-chul of ROK? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lee San-chul from South Korea. What kind of war is likely in Northeast Asia? The riskiest security pending issue that could develop to war? What is it from the Korea perspective? From the South Korean perspective, the riskiest security issue is the nuclear program of DPRK. In 2018, in February in Hanoi, the summit between U.S. and DPRK took place. But since the denuclearization negotiations have fell into a deadlock, but 10 launches of ballistic missiles has been launched, and there has been suspension of inter-Korean relationship. They've also come up with what they refer to as a new road, a very uncertain position. So the North Korean nuclear issue is a direct threat to the peace of the Korean Peninsula. It also undermines the Northeast Asia, the whole of Asia, and the whole of the world. And there has been complete suspension of the denuclearization negotiations between U.S. and North Korea. And with tensions rising, not just the inter-Korean military clash, but there's now a heightened risk of U.S. DPRK clash. If there is a U.S.-North Korea clash, military clash, the peninsula could become a battlefield. And what about China, Russia, and Japan? The neighboring countries of the Korean Peninsula may directly intervene. So that would shackle the very foundations of the security situation in the Korean Peninsula. So the 2018 ROK-US collaboration had led to the ROK-US summit and the US-DPRK summit. And denuclearization of the peninsula to resolve the DPRK nuclear program To switch this uncertain situation into a status of peace needs to be done. And the inter-Korean relationship has to be changed from conflict to reducing the risks for traditional security issue. We were able to achieve an agreement in 2018 after environment was created to hold the North Korea U.S. summit. Finally, that came to a fruition. And going forward, in order to achieve denuclearization, all the neighboring countries have to make efforts. The second point from the ROK perspective is the Chinese Army and Air Force activities near the peninsula. In 2015, PLA Navy in the west side Yellow Sea of the peninsula, the frequency of their activities and size has increased, and they have expanded their operations to very close to the peninsula, and the intelligence aircrafts of PLA on regular basis are intervening into KADIZ, and this is a big threat. So between the military authorities of China and ROK, there must be a hotline that would enable resolution of these issues and communications channel that would allow for resolution of these issues in order to avoid these conflicts. Finally, in winter of 2018, regrettably, the clash between MSDF reconnaissance vehicle and ROK vessel, which was unnecessary. At the government level between Japan and ROK, political trust has to be regained. And between the military authorities, close security cooperation between Japan and the ROK should be ensured through government to government and non-government to non-government efforts. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました。で、今、
Thank you very much. So we have just heard from representatives from 4 countries. And you may think that it is highly dangerous. You may have had that impression. So let me make an analysis into this. Between U.S. and China, there are many rivalries and conflicts. And looking at what is happening in the region, everything seems to be coming head to head, so to speak. And something as an accident could happen, an incident could happen. And everyone have alluded to hotlines or communication mechanisms. In other words, these are not well established. And that has become a big challenge. So we need to think about this. And hotspots were also mentioned. And some deliberate conflict could occur. I very much hope that that would not be the case. But how to manage such potential crisis is something we need to also consider. The hotspots would happen from North Korea in East China Sea, from Taiwan, and also towards the South China Sea. And looking at analysis made by the eminent persons, more than 2 scores, North Korea and South China Sea are listed in those possible hotspots to actually erupt in the year 2020. Then how can we prevent this to happen? How to respond and address this issue? May I turn to speakers who have not yet spoken for 3 minutes each? We have Admiral Kawano, the former the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs. If you could please start. Now, from the point of view of communication, On Senkaku Islands, ever since the nationalization, there has been highly the tense situation seen between China and Japan. Before that, we had some contacts on a defense authority basis, but it has been stopped. Although it has taken a very long time, the so-called although it is not on a hotline basis, but we have been able to establish a communication mechanism at sea between China and Japan. And this, I believe, is a good step forward. And at this moment in time, something to happen on an accidental basis, there is a possibility to do with Senkaku Islands for Japan because of the government, the ships of China and the SDF, the vessels, and Japanese Coast Guard vessels sometimes come to very close contact with each other. And there has been the radar as a sweep been done by the Chinese the vessel, but we have been able to respond in a very cool-headed manner. So we have been able to solve this the issue. But in any case, we have been able to make a major step forward with the communication mechanism to be established between the two countries. And with the Minister of Defense, Mr. Kono, visiting Japan, with this, I believe we will be able to restart the exchange on military-to-military basis between our two countries. Now, can I have a little bit more on North Korea? The many people I know have a grave concern over North Korea because this issue, there has been the first and second phase for the nuclear response, and we have failed in our response. And we have had trust, but we have been deceived by North Korea. But this time, we should give priority to denuclearization and then give economic compensation. And that has been the policy stance. But it seems what North Korea says right now, they want the rewards first and then think about denuclearization. So everything seems to have been reversed, so to speak, head on tails, so to speak. And President Trump has been making statements that with a possible military force to be employed. Now, the JCPOA question of Iran and with the commander being killed, and North Korea seems to be reviewing on their stance vis-a-vis the U.S. and the plenary, the session of the Central the committee of the Korean Workers' Party. Well, we are watching closely what may be happening there.
I want to listen with more serenity, objectively, so I would like to appoint Takahara-san to make the next comment. So DPRK issue and the cross-straits issue or lack of communication, the various phenomena that are occurring in front of our eyes exist. That's one level of looking at the situation, but separate from that perspective, there's yet another deeper, in-depth visualization level, which is the causes of these phenomena. Why do they occur? 2 points come to my mind. First, Japan, US, ROK, and China-Russia side, and the misalignment of strategic goals. This is a fundamental issue. How can this be resolved? This is a very complicated challenge. We no longer have Soviet Union, and after the demise of the USSR, in principle, there's been this misalignment of goals, but this have become a grave issue, partly because of the rise of the national strength of China. So it's deepened in terms of seriousness. Another point is the issue of nationalism. In each country, it has its own political situation. That versus external relationships, how are they interconnected? And that's another issue. And overcoming nationalism. what needs to be done in order to objectively make judgments to lead to appropriate behavior. Even when we try to make communication, our minds may become close to the counterpart, and we human beings are not that smart. So it's not necessarily the case that we can take action based upon objective theory and cognitive notion. So we have to rely more on information rather than emotion. And I think there we face a crisis. So how do we respond to these two issues at a deeper level? If we are to build peace, I think that's also important to think about.
そういう健全な言論
Well, to produce a forum for such a healthy discussion and debate, I believe is important. Maybe I should ask Mr. Che Gun on the topic of North Korea. It's very difficult to predict what will happen. What will be your take on what will likely happen on the opinions that are going forward?
내가 그것을 답할 수 있으면 여기 앉아 있겠습니까? 굉장히 어려운 질문이신데요.
I wish I had a crystal ball. It's a very difficult question. Towards the end of February and beginning of March and April, I'm anticipating some provocation by North Korea because Kim Jong-un has already announced that he will take a new path, new road. And it's just a question of timing when he will take an action. End of February, beginning of March or April, because that is the timing of potential joint exercise between United States and ROK. And this joint exercise could be used as a reason, legitimization for North Korea to provocate, to do a provocation. But the ICBM test, I don't think that will be the immediate result of this provocation. SLBM, launch of SLBM, short-range missiles could be used for the provocation for the time being by North Koreans. And it is likely that the President Trump will turn a blind eye, but the short-range and mid-range missiles could be a fatal threat for ROK and Japan. And second likely timing is October. Immediately before the presidential election in the United States, the President Trump in the run-up to the election, he will likely want to appeal that his negotiation with the North Korean has been producing results, but North Koreans could leverage, take advantage of this Trump's lurching towards negotiations, and North Koreans may try to take advantage of Trump's willingness to show results. I think it is only very fortunate that the summer of this year could be quiet. And another important thing is that timing and the possibility of the provocation by North Korea will depend on how much preparedness we will enjoy on our side and whether there will be a solid cooperation between our three countries. And China and Russia, by placing importance on the ties with the North Korean regime, the tension could be reduced.
かな。まず
Now, how should we go about? Shall I then ask Mr. Zhang Yunlin, Dr. Zhang Yunlin, what about the situation on the Korean Peninsula? What is your view on this, please?
It's okay. Yes. North Korea's nuclear issue is, we understand, is really a threat. But at the same time, we understand it's not a simple thing just to solve the nuclear issue itself. So we have to think to create an environment, condition, and to solve it in a comprehensive way rather than in a simple way. So that's probably a lesson. But, and also bilateral efforts, especially the United States and North Korea, how they behave behave is very crucial if you see the six-party talks experience and lessons we got. So now probably we think in a new approach. We wait or not, I don't know. But we wait for U.S. election, wait for Trump to take something new, or we start now. And during the previous sessions, we discussed a possible, for instance, 5 parties or 4 parties, meetings to discuss these emergent issues. This is a possible way. And also, Mr. Zhang Zhuosheng mentioned China-Russia's initiative. May we have a better consultation and raise this issue on the UN level to get more counterparts rather than seems China, Russia, and the other sides against it. So we have no any progress at all. However, I think we cannot wait, when or how North Korea to make a provocative, because North Korea in the past experience, and they are not so patient to wait so long. They need some kind of progress, need some measures. But the danger is now it's a U.S. election time, and President Trump just sent some message that want to continue, but without any kind of concrete commitments to make it to go. So that's, I think, we are in a very risky time in the near months. Thank you.
Ralph Costa-san.
Dr. Ralph Costa, we shouldn't be waiting for the situation to develop in DPRK. What do you think?
Well, I agree very much. I mean, if there's one thing that the 4 nations represented here strongly agree on, it's that a resumption of nuclear testing or missile testing, which are complete violations of unanimous Security Council resolutions, will be destabilizing, will not be helpful. Therefore, I think our 4 countries need to be sending a very strong, unified message to the North Koreans in advance, telling them that a resumption would be unacceptable and laying out what the consequences would be, rather than waiting until after the event happens, the provocation happens. And then what normally happens is that we go to the Security Council, and the U.S. and Japan are arguing for tough measures. China and Russia are trying to water them down. South Korea is trying to figure out what's happening. And we spend, I think the last time it took 6 or 8 weeks to come up with a resolution, all of which plays into North Koreans' hands. It benefits no one except North Korea. So I think we need to respond to that. I think there's also a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of North Koreans, which could be potentially dangerous. I think the North Koreans believe that they have leverage now over President Trump, and that a threat to do something provocative will somehow or other so undermine his presidential reelection that Trump will cut a bad deal with them just to move forward. This is fundamentally wrong. When we had disputes between the U.S. and China regarding the trade agreement, the stock market went up 500 points, down 500 points. Whenever the North Koreans launched a missile, the stock market didn't move. No one moved. Everyone just said sort of ho-hum and went on. The reality is when the Hanoi talks broke down, the great noise that you heard in the United States was a sigh of relief from both the Democrats and the Republicans. And Mr. Trump's base in particular would be very supportive of a resumption of a hard line with North Korea. The greatest way for him to get criticism from the right would be to cut a deal with North Korea, since any deal that the North Koreans would accept would be seen as a bad deal from the Bolton wing of the Republican Party, and probably from both Democrats and Republicans alike. So he has much more incentive to sort of kick the can down the road or just blame the North Koreans for missing a great opportunity than he is for cutting a good deal or giving in to what might be a provocation on the part of the North Koreans.
Well, we have been talking about different situations. Let me return to the first speaker. This is a gathering of 4 countries. It's not that we are representing governments, so there is obviously a limit as to what we can do. In order to prevent a crisis at hand, what kind of efforts could be made? I mean, we are at a loss, and I know Mr. Koda should have an idea. So why don't I invite Admiral Koda to share with us what he thinks the possible solution could be. I hope I had a crystal ball myself. I wish I had. But there is no panacea. I don't think there is a silver bullet. We are talking about North Korea, right? I don't think there is a silver bullet. I know you'll be critical, and I might sound rough in saying this, but as Mr. Kawano mentioned, in the past, we've lost some wonderful opportunities, opportune moments. We missed opportunities in the past. There were a couple of opportunities in the past. And we gave them a bait, and they got the bait, and that was the end of it. And North Korea have continued to develop missiles and nuclear, and they are ready to deploy them, almost. And now we are at a stage where we try to resolve through negotiations. We have to be mindful that it will take long. And whether you have the guts to go through this prolonged negotiation is a question that we need to ask ourselves. And during this long period, there will be provocations by the North, and ROK will be immediately facing these provocations by the North. And of course, Japan will face some of these provocations directly. But the question is whether we have a patience and persistence in facing these provocations, and that is what we mean by preventing war. In the worst case scenario, there may be casualties that we may have to suffer, the Japanese casualties. But the question is whether Japanese people will be able to maintain calm and be dispassionate to face North Korea. And whether the international community, including China and Russia, can show solidarity against North Korea, that kind of resolve, whether we have that resolve or not. And the diagonal opposite of that is taking military action. And I'm sure, I suspect, the United States, Japan, China are not for taking military actions. And of course, if we were to take a military action, obviously the United States will be at the center. But I don't think it will be easier to for the American military to take actions unless there is an extreme situation. So I think it is important that the people of Korea and Japan, ROK and Japan, whether they have a resolve to persevere the provocations by North Korea with patience. That is the question that we need to discuss.
Now, this is strictly my personal view, but top leaders, roughly speaking, there are 2 types. Those who would give ideology the priority, and those who would calculate on economic front. Those who would go ideological, the threshold of going to war is much lower. It would be something like Hitler or the Crusade in the Middle Ages. Those that we think about ideology, but rather than that, those who calculate economically, they would be more cautious because they would always think about the pros and cons and calculate. President Trump, I believe, belongs to the latter. But looking at the behavior of President Trump, I would like to ask my American friends their view as well. The region should take responsibility for what is going on in region. U.S. will not try to police the other regions. And when lives of the Americans are at stake, the U.S. would always make retaliation. That, I believe, is the position of President Trump. There have been the statements being made, and unpredictability that has been said about President Trump back in. There has been a lot of pressure. So that was in 2017. So I believe North Korea, because of this military pressure, the possibility of the use of force, they have actually led to North Korea coming to the table for negotiation 2018, and Singapore and then Hanoi, when they have went on with the dialogue, I believe they have made assessment on their own on President Trump and his personality. And I think they may have thought that President Trump would be very cautious in actually using the force. So I believe North Korea have actually come forward. And that, I believe, what has been happening until last year. But then, once again, President Trump recently has been talking about the use of force, and the Secretary at ESPA has been saying that U.S. can always win. And these are the messages we hear from U.S. these days. So what is most frightening? Because of the U.S. military capability, North Korea, I believe, is once again reviewing on the situation. So provocation by North Korea under these circumstances will be very difficult, because the U.S. may take a different action this time. So what would be most important would be the trilateral collaboration amongst U.S., Japan, and ROK. Within the ROK, the government and the ruling party, there are many who make publicly clear that North Korea is no longer a threat. If that is the case, then it would be very, very difficult to try to work in partnership with that ROK. So I have concern over this with that ROK.
Listening to Admiral Kano, I have to ask you, two of you, to respond. Ambassador Scheer, what do you think about Kano-san's evaluation of President Trump? Is that his personality? Do you agree? We never would allow DPRK to become a nuclear state. Is the same bold determination, resolve shared by the U.S.?
I think it's pretty clear that the president strongly desires denuclearization of North Korea, and he is willing to engage with Kim Jong-un in an effort to achieve that state. The Hanoi round that took place last year failed to achieve results, but the president has made an effort to suggest to Kim that we're still open for talks. I'm not a spokesman for the U.S. government anymore, but I have to believe that the president is willing to coordinate closely with his trilateral, with the U.S., or with Japan and the ROK in a trilateral context. I think there's an urgency for something like a five-party meeting for the five parties surrounding the Korean Peninsula to demonstrate their continued commitment to sanctions and to urge North Korea to adhere to a freeze. I also think that we should go into a five-party round on the basis of very strong trilateral U.S.-Japan ROK coordination. It's clear, I think, that President Xi played a very strong role in discouraging Kim Jong-un from conducting any more missile and nuclear tests at the outset of the Singapore and Hanoi process. And I think it would be useful for President Xi to continue encouraging Kim Jong-un to maintain the freeze.
Mr. Lee Issan-chul, I visited the Blue House in Seoul and had this conversation. As Mr. Kawano said, it seems that ROKs may have some different views. ROK's views towards North Korea and towards China. In ROK, President of the ROK and the Korean will be responding to the situation. With regards to the North Korean provocation, I know that you have a lot of interest. It seems to me that what form will the provocation by North Korea take against ROK, against U.S.? Would it be take the form of direct military actions? It will be a direct provocation of a sort. It's very difficult to judge. ROK military is fully prepared, and in the face of provocation, ROK military could take a very strong response. So we are prepared for that. And U.S. military forces is of the strongest around, very influential. If North Korean were to, I think it is very difficult for the North Koreans to wage military provocation. But if and when North Koreans engage in provocations, strategic provocation with nuclear and missiles could be a possibility, because North Koreans want to demonstrate that North Korea could be a direct threat to the United States. That's what North Koreans want to demonstrate. So unless the North Korean is a serious threat for the United States, Americans will not seriously deal with North Korea. That is what North Koreans believe. So North Koreans want to be felt as a direct threat to the United States. And to do that, so the provocation will be for that purpose. Then how can we solve the situation? We have been focusing on sanctions and pressure. These have not paid. If you place too much emphasis on dialogue, the dialogue has not necessarily produced any results. So it has to be a balanced approach, either dialogue or pressure. Neither of these two will resolve the issue of North Korea. So we have to combine pressure and dialogue. We need to strike the right balance between pressure and dialogue so that we can guide North Koreans to a desirable direction. In order to do that, it is very important for us to have North Koreans come back to the table with the United States, and they want security of their regime even after abandoning nuclear power, and inducement or incentive. The Japan, ROK, and the United States should work closely so that we can show incentives to the North Koreans that the regime will be secure even after they abandon nuclear weapons. And we need to explore forms for that.
So, Mr. Zhang Tuoshen, as Ambassador David Chiu has said, in the past, North Korea, there has been a background to accelerate the process toward denuclearization. President Xi Jinping has taken a positive approach, but because of the conflict between U.S. and China right now, that is not really happening. But the nuclearization of North Korea is also a grave risk for China as well. So isn't there a possibility that rather than carrot, but stick should also be strengthened once again by China? Of course, the carrot can also be combined, but what about China once again turning or taking a very strict stance against North Korea? Is there a possibility, Mr. Zhang Tuoshen?
I think in 2017, at that time, the international community joined hands to put more pressure on North Korea. Especially, we passed several UN security resolutions. So the sanctions is very, very serious. So this is one of the reasons to push North Korea go back to the negotiation table. However, since the 2018, U.S. regard China as the #1 competitor and put more pressure on China. So North Korea's calculation has changed. They think you two major powers have a serious difference. So this is has a very negative impact on North Korea's behavior. So this is the first point. Secondly is China, even in this situation, China still strongly support the U.S. DPRK's talks. So the first time is China provide airplanes to send King to the Singapore. And the second time, China, the train sent King to the Hanoi. Yeah. Even now, so China-Russia's joint proposal, that is, we still hope the USA and the North Korea's bilateral talks can go forward, can make progress. So anyway, I think denuclearization is really in the interest of China. Otherwise, if North Korea became a nuclear state under so huge pressure, the NPT could collapse. And what what will Japan do in the future? What will the South Korea do? And if they don't develop nuclear weapons, but now there are voices in Japan and South Korea said they should have a nuclear sharing, which is something like happened in the Cold War in Europe. U.S. deploy nuclear weapons in Europe, and those allies could use it. So if Japan can use it and South Korea can use it, it would be very dangerous. So China really hope we can join hands to realize the denuclearization. We don't hope North Korea become a country similar to India and Pakistan. So anyway, I hope U.S. could would like to improve the relationship with China, to stabilize the relationship, and join hands with China to cooperate with each other on denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula.
北朝鮮だけで話になって
We've begun to concentrate only on DPRK. So what should we do? Takahara-san. Let's work together, they began to say. But then U.S. and China are at odds with each other right now. Japan. There's, you said so, but there's no voice for Japan to become a nuclear state. We have the non-nuclear principle, so please let the Chinese general public know that there is no such voice in China. But Takahara-san, what's your take? As mentioned by Mr. Jianchu Shen, in 2017, U.S. and China coordinated with each other in their approach to DPRK. And back then, Kim Jong-un was left without foreign policy options. The only means was testing. Since late 2017, there began a wedge between U.S. and China with the help of Moon Jae-in and with the festivity of Pyeongchang Olympic Games. He took advantage of the wedge and expanded the space for foreign policy maneuver. So back to 2017, it's possible, if it's possible to bring things back to 2017, that's fine, but trust between U.S. and China has collapsed. There's the possibility that the situation would change, like a different president winning the election, then both countries may begin to say, oh, hey, let's start afresh from scratch. But if this strategic competition between the United States and China has become so exposed, whoever becomes the president, this gap may not be filled. And yet, particularly for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the interests of the United States and China are completely aligned. So that was mentioned by our U.S. friends, China friends. So back to six-party talks or five-party talks. That kind of voice is already emerging in both countries, U.S. and China. So Japan, including ourselves, can participate. We have been asserting that multilateral framework is important. So us taking their size is the role that we ought to be playing.
Thank you, Ambassador Scheer. Let me go back to the first point. Please educate me on this. Between United States and China, there are mechanisms to prevent collisions. For example, MMCA is there, and there is MOU of 2014 and 2015. INCSI was between the United States and former Soviet Union, or you also have INCSI between China and US? So between the United States and China, the situation of crisis management, do you think the mechanism gives you a sense of relief when the naval vessels get close to each other? Do you think the communication lines are available between the United States and China, or is it that United States and China are trying to avoid each other, not inviting the other party to conferences? What is the situation?
The deterioration in the level of strategic trust notwithstanding, the U.S. and China continue to have a fairly diverse range of contacts designed to minimize risk or reduce risk and to manage crises. And those mechanisms or those methods include the establishment of hotlines. We have a number of hotlines between Washington and Beijing, including the defense telephone link, used most recently, I believe, in December, between Secretary of Defense Esper and his Chinese counterpart, Defense Minister Wei Fenghe. We have the Military Maritime Consultative Mechanism, which is an annual meeting among naval and air officers designed to exchange information on our respective naval and air operations in the region and to discuss the implementation of another mechanism that we have, which is an MOU on unexpected encounters at sea and in the air. We achieved this MOU through a negotiation conducted in 2014 and 2015. It includes rules of behavior for vessels at sea, for encounters between vessels and aircraft, and for encounters between aircraft as well. Those rules of behavior are based on an INCSEE we concluded with the Soviets in 1972, an Incidents at Sea agreement, and on the CUES, the Convention on Unexpected Encounters at Sea, which was concluded by the Western Naval Symposium in 2014. That includes a number of East Asian countries. So we have a fairly wide range and robust means of exchanging views. And even as our overall bilateral relationship has deteriorated to some extent, we have continued to, we have maintained those channels and continued to use them to reduce risk. And I think it would be worth it for other countries in the region, including China, the ROK, and Japan, to have a look at what we're doing bilaterally with the Chinese and perhaps extend what agreements they already have on risk reduction to include rules of behavior as well.
I just add one point about the North Korean nuclear issue. So I still remember before 2018, North Korea said we will never go back to the negotiating table, and we will never give up nuclear weapons. But in early 2018, they said we will have a new strategic line. We will focus on economic development. We would like to go back to the negotiating table. But of course, it is to realize the denuclearization, but it's conditional. We must keep its mind. It's a conditional denuclearization. So now the problem is whether U.S. and North Korea can make some compromise to make a substantial first step. For example, if North Korea agree to close down the whole facilities in the Yanbian, so U.S. should agree to lift part of the sanctions. So this should be the simultaneous action, not just North Korea you should do first, then we shall give you some rewards. But very difficult for North Korea to accept. So China believe should be the simultaneous actions and the step by step. This is the only way to resolve this issue.
If we do Yongbyon, then are you saying that everything will stop if those two steps are taken simultaneously? So they give up Yongbyon. Is that what you're saying? Do you think they'd agree?
Dialogue. North Korea unilaterally declared they would like to close down the Yanbian facility. But the problem is they don't say how many facilities in Yanbian. U.S. asked for a name list of the Yanbian facilities. But at the same time, North Korea asked for some to lift some sanctions, U.S. also denied they would not lift any sanctions. So the talk collapsed. So, but now they could sit down to negotiate again. So I think there is still a hope, but the opportunity window has been narrowed, much narrowed.
今の話はどうですか。つまり
What will be your reaction? Bolton and others did not buy in, right? What was offered by Kim Jong Un, and he's saying the Chinese friend is saying that was a problem. But would you agree?
My sense is that the American position, I don't know this for sure, and the American side hasn't made it entirely clear in public yet, but my sense is that the American position has shifted since Hanoi, and that the American side is more than willing to consider a parallel process in which both sides make concessions on a step-by-step basis. I think that was the substance of Mr. Begin's attempt to conduct a discussion with the Koreans in October in Stockholm, in which the Koreans basically walked out of the room. So this isn't just I don't think we should look solely at the behavior of the United States in determining how to move forward. I think the North Koreans have to get serious as well, and I think a first step in encouraging the North Koreans to get serious and encouraging the U.S. to engage with the North Koreans is to hold a five-party meeting at which we can demonstrate our solidarity on sanctions, on North Korea's maintaining the freeze, and on the prospect for a serious negotiation between the United States and North Korea.
時間がもうないんですが、ちょっと頂戴せ、
We are running out of time, but I have one question to Mr. Jiang Chuoshen regarding what you have said before. Also, Ambassador Xie had said that the crisis management the mechanism may be binding and it may be valid, but is it true between U.S. and China? We have been listening to remarks that it is not really functional in many ways. But do you think that the communication between U.S. and China is fine, or do you think it is insufficient, the communication mechanism between the two countries?
I think between China and the USA, we have established more crisis management mechanism compared with that between China and Japan, China and South Korea. We have top leaders hotlines. We have defense ministries hotline. We have MMCA, and we have two memorandums. But also we have a very serious track 2 security crisis management talk since 2004. But I think now one good thing is in the past 2 years, the two countries' defense ministers, when they met each other, they said they would like to let the mirror-to-mirror relationship become the stabilizer of the China-U.S. relations. In the history, the mirror-to-mirror relations are far behind the general relationship. But now the general relationship has seriously deteriorated. If the mirror-to-mirror relations go worse, it would be very, very dangerous. So both countries hope to keep contacts. So now, last year, most of the governmental high-level talks has suspended, unfortunately. But the mirror-to-mirror dialogues, most of them still going on. So it's good news. So I hope we can, at least we can try our best to keep the mirror-to-mirror relations still going on. Very, very important.
We don't have time, but Zhang Yinlin and Ralph Kosa are eyes met, so brevity would be appreciated. Zhang Yulin and Ralph Kosa, please.
concerning China-U.S. relationship. The greater concern for China is not military. It's overall strategy against China, especially this new measures adopted by Trump administration block China on technology, on many things, I think. So we need to have a comprehensive improvement of, or we call it the strategic trust, and then, can move forward to the other areas. Otherwise, I don't think, we can move forward at all. Thank you.
I think that the one thing that President Trump and Kim Jong-un had in common going into the Hanoi summit was that each one thought he could outsmart the other one. And they both discovered they were wrong, and now they're still trying to figure out what to do next. I think the U.S. Has signaled an increased degree of flexibility, but we need to be very careful on what North Korea offered. North Korea has not yet said they are prepared for North Korean denuclearization. They've talked about Korean Peninsula denuclearization, which must start with the, quote, end to U.S. hostile policy, which is the end of the U.S. nuclear threat, which has been defined as no U.S. troops on the peninsula, et cetera, before they can even start talking about denuclearization. So we're still a long ways to go, and I think the North Koreans are clearly part of the problem at this point, and we ought to be clear about that.
はい、ありがとうございました。今皆さん
Thank you very much. So, as you may have had a thought after the listening to the debate, of course, in the closed session, we had also taken up the other issues, such as the Taiwan issue, even more than the North Korea, that the war could erupt because of some accident happening in Japan, China, and Japan are okay. They must try to address it properly, to try to create a good mechanism for communication in order to avoid these to happen. And we need to have a review process being made every year. So through the Asia Peace Conference, I hope that we will be able to review on these issues and make the appropriate proposals and have on a bilateral basis at the meetings and come up with appeals that we could make public to the whole of the world. I would like to thank all the panelists for very realistic and good discussion today. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。これにて
I'd like to thank the panelists, and this is the end of the first session. This is the second session for the Asia Peace Conference. How can we build a stable and sustainable regional order into the future? So let me introduce those panelists who will be newly joining us from China. Professor Dejia Chinko, who is the Dean of the School of International Studies of the Peking University, and who is the member of the Standing Committee of the PCC, and Dr. Douglas Parr, the Distinguished Fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And there will be new panelists joining for the Japanese side, 3 of them. Let me introduce them. We have earlier heard from former Minister of Defense, Honorable Nakatani, member of the House of Representatives, and seated next to him is Professor Soeya of the Keio University. And lastly but not least, Dr. Masuda, Senior Fellow in the China Division at the NIDS. And the other panelists that have been remaining and continuing from the first session. So let us begin the second session, and it will continue to be moderated by President Kudo. Well, initially, I will take the microphone myself because I'm in the same age as Mr. Kudo. And Mr. Kudo will be the first speaker, so it will be strange for him to introduce himself. So let me introduce him.
We will follow the same procedure as session 1. The first person we will ask to speak is President Kudo, and please stick to the time limit of 5 minutes.
のは得意なので大丈夫です。
Yes, timekeeping is my strength, so I would like to start. So what I would like to say, what is the purpose of the Asia Peace Conference? What does it stand for? We don't want the war in this region. It may sound rather abstract, but this is the absolute hope and expectation of the citizens. In setting the agenda, as a think tank, we need to align ourselves with the needs and the expectation of the citizens. If not, we will not be supported by the citizens. A diplomacy not supported by the citizens would be weak and vulnerable. So we would like to have an agenda which can be shared by everybody. So the peace as an agenda is very difficult to be realized. And that is what we are discovering. There are many things we need. To start with, the relationship between and amongst the different countries must be stable. If there are highly unstable bilateral relationship, the region itself will be unstable. Do we see a stable relationship right now? We see a major rivalry between the United States and China. Both are mistrusting and distrusting each other. And between China and Japan, Prime Minister Abe has been the very forthcoming, and we have been looking for a new stage, trying to make the welcome to the visit by President Xi Jinping. And on bilateral basis, Japan and ROK, it is not that are going well. So bilateral relationship need to be stabilized more. And to be frankly speaking, bilateral dialogue, we need to seek stability for the bilateral relationship. And on top of that, we would like to go beyond that to make it multilateral. So naturally, our multilateral efforts should be premised upon the bilateral relationship, the how to structure the mechanism, including all these. In 2012, there have been an incident in the Senkaku Islands, and there was a critical situation happening between Japan and China. And the eyes of the world were on us. And we believe, of course, that Senkaku Islands is our territory. But even with the territorial issue, I don't think it is not that we cannot have a dialogue. Because if conflict occurs, the war, as seen by citizens, could happen, which would destroy the peace. So we have gone to the Beijing to make public the no-war pledge. And foreign policy is something to be done between governments. Of course, I am fully aware of that, but that I don't think would be sufficient enough. That was my feeling, because when we look at Asian region, government-to-government diplomacy have not gone well. In many cases, it has been rare when we had a good relationship diplomatically, because there have been many situations where the countries have come to head-to-head with each other. So what we can do in the private sector, a role is to be played by the private sector is needed. So on bilateral relationship and on the regional basis, we need to play a role so that we can seek stability in the region. So we would like to start a process, and that was the no-war pledge. And if we have come to agreement bilaterally, we should spread that to multilateral basis. Anti-hegemony and also rule of law. There were two other principles that the four countries have come to agreement. And there is no lie there. Many people think that China is engaged in hegemonic behavior. In certain circumstances, I may also think as such. And that from China's point of view, China may also say that U.S. is taking hegemonic activities. Now, for the anti-hegemony the clause in the agreement between USSR and United States for the INF agreement and so forth. It is not just looking at the USSR and pointing the finger to USSR. The both sides, all the countries, they should refrain themselves from taking hegemonic activities and behaviors. So these are the three key words: anti-hegemony, rule of law, and also trying to not go for war at all. So, as you have seen from a discussion during the first session, I don't think we can immediately move forward. What we need to do is to employ the existing mechanism, try not to accelerate and escalate, and to be hot-headed. We should try to contain and have a fight with more of a nationalistic the view within your own country. And we would like to start the process. And as a consequence, if we could have a peace, and that is good. Thank you.
You were relatively short on a long battle. Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Paul.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to our wonderful audience for spending so much time here today. I'd like to express why it is I think this is an important undertaking here at Genron NPO and in Japan with our colleagues from the important countries of the Northeast Asia region. If you look back to the post-World War II era, Asia has had the opportunity to focus on its internal political and economic development. And quite uniquely in the world, Asia has done very well. But also the Asia-Pacific region is different from other parts of the world as well in other respects. And that is, it's not a harmonious part of the world. It's very diverse. There may be some common cultural roots, but there are very different national priorities and interests and cultural traditions among the region. It's not a place that lends itself to NATO-like customs, NATO-like behavior. Europe took a long time to get to that situation, and Asia still has a great distance to go. Now, in the period of development, political and economic, the U.S. provided sort of an overarching presence and stabilizing force. Not always. The Korean War was thrust on us in 1950. The Vietnam War we embraced probably incorrectly or with mixed motives. But for the most part, it's provided the substance, the structure for a stable development, including China's quite dramatic development. China was welcomed into the world and accepted as an important contributor, even though for a long period it was focused on its internal development, not externally. At the end of the Cold War, the U.S. squandered a lot of its leadership on the Iraq and Afghan wars and misdirected a lot of energy and money over the period. We're now at a point when very important structural changes are coming to this region and to the American role in this region. China has risen. It has a different set of priorities. Our friends in Korea, Japan, and elsewhere in the region have developed enormously. They've got new capacities, educated populations, effective leaderships in most cases. And the U.S. has come to a point where we are turning inward and not bearing the same kind of responsibility that we did before. In another way of putting this, this is a time when the developing countries of the region, the so-called middle powers, not the superpowers, need to take more responsibility for their own security. They need to step up with ideas on how, as Genron NPO is trying to do, to create an East Asia peace mechanism. It's not going to be easy coming from the governments. It's going to have to come from the ground up. We need help from the top down as well, but we as private citizens are in a position to try to give incentives to handle the management of tensions as they arise, or preferably prevent those tensions from arising and causing conflict to break out. In the 21st century, a conflict between the United States and China is really unthinkable. It would destroy the 21st century. I think the leaderships of both the United States and China know that. But between outright conflict between the existing superpower and the rising superpower, there are lots of opportunities for things to go very wrong. And we've been talking today about the Korean Peninsula, East China Sea, tensions potentially across the Taiwan Strait, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. These are all areas that are going to require imaginative solutions, hard work, realistic expectations, and the benefit of a lot of people's time and energy. And for that purpose, we have joined here with Mr. Kudo in an effort to see if we can't work from the ground up to address the challenges of this important transition period at the end of the Cold War, end of the post-Cold War period, and the beginning of a new and as yet unnamed period of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we look around the world in recent months and years, situations unthinkable a couple of years are rising, and it seems that we are losing orientations. We are at a loss as to the future of the mankind. And we believe we are decent people. It is very important to exchange views on important issues amongst decent people in a dispassionate way. I believe this is a wonderful opportunity for us to exploit. I have a lot of reverence to all speakers, and next speaker is Mr. Jin Jingguo from China, another speaker who I have a lot of respect.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. This session is about building a sustainable peace, a regional order in the future. How can we do it? I think that we are facing a lot of challenges. Despite all the differences, the countries in the region may have, most of them, probably with the exception of North Korea, they are stakeholders in the existing regional order. 40 years ago, China was not a stakeholder. Now China is. As such, there is every good reason for countries in the region to work together to build a stable and sustainable regional order rather than working apart against each other. Okay? So this is very important. Most countries probably would agree. In doing so, however, we're facing a lot of difficulties, especially lack of trust or trust deficit between the countries. At the moment, probably the most prominent case is China and the US. The relationship is in trouble, and it's still getting worse instead of getting better. Okay. Under the circumstances, we have to think of ways to address regional problems, especially address the problem of strategic trust, distrust. For that reason, I think we need to enhance existing dialogue and consultation, both at the official and non-official level. So dialogue and consultation is in great need. we are facing a situation that dialogue and consultation is being reduced, well, has been reducing rather than increasing. This trend must be arrested. And also, we should make good use of the existing international regional security institutions to deal with the challenges. You know, over the years, we have built quite a few mechanisms for consultation and dialogue. For example, East Asia Summit, six-party talks, China, Japan, Korea Summit, and other institutions. So we should attach greater importance to these institutions and engage in real dialogue and communication on these platforms. We should also develop new platforms for communication and consultation. Because the informality and flexibility, the second track dialogues has a particularly important role to play. Many of the things cannot be talked about, at least cannot be discussed in great depth in official settings. Okay? But they can be discussed and analyzed and explored at a greater depth in private, in non-official settings. So it's important for us to develop and strengthen dialogues, second track dialogues. And we need to be creative when we engage in dialogues in developing new ideas about how to prevent crisis, managing crisis, as well as avoiding conflicts. Finally, in this regard, I think the Asia Peace Conference can play a very useful role in bringing together like-minded people to assess the problems we are facing and also to develop proposals, constructive proposals to address these problems. So that explains why we are all here to endorse the initiation of the Asia Peace Conference. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。確かに。
Thank you very much. Just as you say, we need to have different platforms to come together, to sit down and to talk with each other. There are many things that we should think about, not just in our minds, but also from heart to heart. Video conferencing is fine, but we should come face to face from time to time and have more emotional dialogue, to have feelings, to be frankly being put forward. And that is also important. And last but not least, from ROK, we have Dr. Chang Po.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will be the last speaker.
Since I
will be the last speaker for the session. So there's nothing that I can add to the other panelists. But as Professor Takahara and other speakers have already said, the most important thing would be to have a shared perception, a shared understanding on peace. And I believe that is the very purpose of the Asia Peace Conference. That would be a very good platform for this purpose. So I would like to express my appreciation to Mr. Kudo in this regard. If I may also make some additional comments, when we think of peace and speak of peace, what is the kind of peace we are talking about? Is it more simple peace where there is no war at all? Can we call it the peace? Or where what we think as valuable values are being realized, would it be called a peace? We need to come to agreement as to the definition of peace. Secondly, together with the efforts to be undertaken to bring solution to the present issues, we need to prepare ourselves for the future. There are three things necessary. We need to have a mechanism to bring peace in the future. We need new codes and new norms and procedures for this purpose. I believe there are disagreements on these points. And as Dr. Zhang Cho-Shen and Mr. Ju Kung-Koo has mentioned about the different stages, 2 stages, the 3 stages. But I believe that we should immediately move to the multilateral forum. We should respect each other in terms of differences, but we should build confidence by coming to the multilateral forum and have exchange of views. The most important thing is the desirable picture to be seen for the Northeast Asia. We need to seek something that we can agree upon. We need to have more in-depth debate and have more frank and candid exchange of views. The China's dream, the U.S. dream, and ROK and Japanese dreams, our dreams may be different, but when do we try to align the dreams, to try to create a picture that is perfect and complete, the efforts must be undertaken in this regard. So the platforms and existing mechanisms must be utilized and also respected. Even though we may complete a multilateral security mechanism, I believe the importance of all our different nations would be also preserved, not to try to substitute all the different mechanisms or the platforms. We need to think about complementing each other. So we should refrain from unilateral behavior. Unilateral action is the very source of mistrust and distrust and conflict, not to act one-sidedly, but try to together make efforts to seek common ground. As have been discussed so far, what I recently think about is, can we really trust and be confident about the United States? Because the behavior taken by the Trump administration and all the different statements made by the Trump government, what we thought as a desirable and ideal leadership is no longer seen for the United States. In Northeast Asia, can the United States continue to be the stabilizer? I hope that the U.S. will continue to make efforts to be trusted by the others. And I hope that self-restraint could also be exercised in this regard as well. Of course, there are different specific issues at hand, but if possible, at the Asia Peace Conference, if Northeast Asia vision could be put forward, that could be meaningful. It would be on a private sector level, but we could present our vision statement to the government, and we could create a foundation and common ground for all of us. I have hope for this. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm in complete agreement because the reality is as harsh as the one we are faced with today. We need to talk about our ideals. I think that is the environment and timing we are in today. That's the end of my moderatorship, and I give back the microphone to President Kudo. You have given me the microphone right at the most difficult timing, but Mr. Chega, what you said was exactly what I was thinking, so that's the question I ask. For example, Nakatani-san, you're a very busy person. Thank you for coming. When I had a telephone conversation with you, you said that that's the theme of my life work. What's your dream? When you hear peace in Northeast Asia, how were you trying to build peace? Do you have an image? And how do you think it's possible? When I say life work is the Asian version NATO. That's the goal. But it's far further ahead. Berlin Wall has broken, Tiananmen Square incident occurred, ROK. From military regime, democratization has taken place. And something we thought would never be possible occurred. And new Cold War between US and China. Prevention is something we think is impossible. But what kind of framework would they be? INF has expired, so Chinese missiles are being developed, and US is also developing. So now an arms race is occurring. So arms reduction conference or de-escalation of US-Sino tension and management of nuclear development, disarmament conference. So this kind of security conference for the sake of de-escalation of tension is possible, and it's something that Japan should take the lead to advocate. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is hosting the Japan-ROK China Summit. More than 50 G2G conferences being held, some at the ministerial level. So if we make a suggestion, it may be possible to have US join. So US, Japan, China, ROK Summit might be possible, withdrawing. And who is the common enemy? Coronavirus. If untouched, it will be uncontrollable, cyber, maritime. And nothing has been done yet. And also the natural environment or disaster. Under these common themes, we're hopeful that some agreement can be stricken. NAPCI, Northeast Asia Peace Initiative, is being advocated by ROK. Maybe ROK is in a position that makes it easy for them to take the lead. In Jeju, you could establish a secretariat to cause progress in the Northeast Asia Peace Initiative that may lead to Asia version NATO. Is China included in NATO's Asia version? Yes.
Of course. Wonderful. Moving on to our friends from abroad, let me ask you this question to Professor Soya. I know that you have vision. What kind of vision do you have for the Northeast Asia? Let me start with a lip service to Mr. Kudo. This framework comprising of 4 countries, I believe, is of critical importance. So far, we have had a multilateral process with ASEAN at the center. But we all know, including the ASEANs themselves, there is a limit to how far they can go. But why is it that we have had no choice but to focus on ASEAN because Northeast Asians have not been playing the role? So ASEAN have argued that they had to be in the driver's seat because there is an absence of initiatives by those countries in the Northeast Asia. But we all know that there is a limit as to the process with ASEAN at the center. Unless we see a breakthrough, Asian-wide multilateral framework cannot be achieved. If these 4 countries could start a process to realize a level of cooperation, we will not be negating the ASEAN process, but we could overcome the limit that has been faced by ASEAN, and that is the potential that this 4-country grouping could perhaps have in the coming years. So that was my first point. Doug talked about the importance of middle power. That is, and I know that he wants me to speak on this. From that perspective, amongst the 4 countries that we have, US, China, each of these two countries is unilateral. So the question is, to what extent the remaining two could control the unilateralism on the part of both the United States and China, but there are obviously limit as to how much we can do, the remaining two countries can do. But if there is any impact that the remaining two countries can do, is that whether the countries other than the United States and China could build a substantial cooperation. If superpowers look at the regional powers, and perhaps there is a tendency, particularly in China, personally speaking, it seems that from superpowers' perspective, the divide and rule is a very useful measure. So what the remaining two countries have to do is to do the complete opposite by promoting cooperation, not to counter the major powers, because there is no availability of countermeasures for us. So what can the two countries, ROK and Japan, can build, and how are we going to approach this delicate relationship between the United States and China? I believe will comprise the middle power strategy, in my understanding. And if that approach is to be taken for Japan, ROK is a critically important partner, perhaps to the extent it is strategic. Therefore, we have United States, China on one side, and Japan and ROK on the other side. And that is why I believe this platform is very important, so that we can achieve coordination between Japan and ROK. To be more specific, Mr. Chan said during this session, and Mr. Chan said, others have said during the morning session, but the framework of Japan, China, and ROK, this framework is very important, trilateral framework, and we used to focus on economic issues. I mean, that's what we discussed in the morning, but this trilateral cooperation should expand into the security arena, the trilateral cooperation between Japan, China, and ROK. So from the United States, the framework of Japan, U.S., and China is an important framework. And both the United States and China are looking at each other and trying to send messages to us. So that is the structure. So to what extent Japan and ROK could share the same position will have a significant implication on this overlapping trilateral relations when against the backdrop of rivalry between the United States and China, in order not to destabilize, what kind of cooperation Japan and ROK could pursue? I mean, that is a strategic question that we need to address, and I think that is something that we can explore in this quadrilateral framework. To say bluntly, Japan-ROK cooperation can achieve a breakthrough to bring about a new era in Northeast Asia. With a hopeful note, I would like to conclude.
David Shea-san.
I have one question to Ambassador Shea. In this region, we need to decide on different rules, but in order to make this happen, Japan and U.S. must strengthen our capability to execute the deterrence in this region. Japan-U.S. Security Pact has been celebrating 60th anniversary 2 days ago. I believe Japan-U.S. relationship and alliance is crucial. But both countries need to abide by the freedom and democracy, the rules in the society, and that is given in Article 2 of the security arrangement. And we very much hope that happens, but I do have uncertainty of the United States today. In Asia, which is the growth center of the world, everybody in Asia is looking for economic prosperity and peace. But with the U.S. presence here, what kind of community or society that you are expecting to see in Asia? In what way and to what U.S. would like to make contribution for? Or would you be just looking at from the perspective of U.S.-China relations alone?
As a realist, I have to believe that if we are going to build a regional order, based in part on the establishment of multilateral frameworks devoted to working out our problems diplomatically. As a realist, I have to believe that if we're going to do that successfully, it has to be based on strong, credible deterrence and a stable balance of power throughout the region. It's also my belief that a U.S.-Japan, continuing U.S.-Japan alliance is a necessary ingredient in that stable balance of power. Now, the region is evolving, and over the 60 years of the security treaty, our security relationship has evolved as well. It has experienced crises in the past. It's experienced big challenges, and it has always adapted itself to new changes in the region. So I think that there remains an important role for the alliance in the region, and I think it should be an alliance in which the balance of influence between the United States and Japan reflects Japan's new confidence in its role in the region, reflects Japan's interest in playing a larger security and economic role in the region, and reflects Japan's interest in helping to devise the rules of the road for a new order. So I look at our effort here as extremely important, but also it's an effort that has to be based on a realistic assessment of the power relations among us and where they can go in the future. On the significance of the Asia Peace Conference, I can tell you that as a former senior official, senior officials never have enough time, resources, or information to make perfect decisions. Nor do they have a lot of opportunities to raise their eyes from their inboxes and look at the big picture, to look at what things are possible in an evolving situation. And I believe it's certainly the case that activities like the Asia Peace Conference can help give those poor, overworked senior officials in our capitals the opportunity to raise their eyes above their inboxes and think about the big picture, what the future holds, and how we can bring a peaceful future about.
はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you. Dr. Jianqiu Shen, I have to ask you a very difficult question. What's the vision upheld by China on the Northeast Asia vision? Japan and China, or Japan and the United States has showed their vision. You may not be such a person, but there are some Chinese who want to kick out Japan and the United States from this region. What's your desirable picture of this region? How should it look like?
For China, it's a difficult task to deal with the military alliance in this region. So in this region, there are two key military alliances. One is U.S.-Japan alliance, the other is U.S.-South Korea alliance. But for all the military alliance, it's exclusive. So China is outside it. So this is a problem. But now I think China has taken a very practical policy. So maybe you can see China's white paper, which is published in 2017, January. Within that, there is a part just talking about the Asia-Pacific security architecture. So in this part, China said the military alliances and the multilateral framework will coexist for a long time. So we only hope the military alliance could decrease or maybe give up the confrontation and increase transparency and play a constructive role. So I really hope in the future the two military alliances could play a constructive role in this region and also have cooperation with China on dealing with the non-traditional security to keep the ceilings of communication. So a lot of things we can have cooperation. And also in the future, maybe we can have several trilateral talks. For example, China, USA, Japan. So in the past, several times, three countries talk about it. But unfortunately, we can't have this kind of talk. But in the future, also, we can have this kind of talk. We can talk how to manage the differences, how to cooperate on dealing with the non-traditional security. We can also talk about how to decrease the misunderstanding, so increase the mutual trust. So there are a lot of things that we could do. So in the future, for China, China's vision in this region, we really hope we can have more cooperation and we have the capability to manage the differences, especially the East China Sea disputes. In the East China Sea, China, South Korea, and Japan has disputes. And also the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. But on this issue, four of us, we have, generally speaking, we have common interests to realize the denuclearization. So we should try our best to increase the cooperation. But finally, I think we should establish a multilateral organization. So my friends, Professor Jia Qingguo proposed maybe 6-party talks could be this kind of a multilateral organization in the future, and maybe East Asia Summit could also play a very important role. It's a 10+8, including USA. So anyway, on the one side, the military alliance will continue play its role, but on the other side, we should try our best to establish the multilateral organizations. Finally, I want to say one thing is, I hope the military alliance have some transformation. For example, the NATO. NATO in the Cold War, it's just a military alliance. But now they said NATO is a political and a military alliance. So also, I think the decrease the nature of a military and increase the political nature. So it would be helpful. Anyway, China will have a practical policy, prepare to cooperate with the military alliance and coexistent with the alliance. So for a long time, USA always have a concern. China try to squeeze US military presence in this region. So now it's not the goal of China. China don't have this kind of capability.
Hi,
Thank you. Basically, what you have said is very important when we try to design such an architecture. So alliances should be taken as seen as a given, but it is also important to build a multilateral set of rules, and that is to realize a set of rules for ensuring coexistence of the United States and China in this region. What will be your take, Mr. Takahara? I think it was in December last year that Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping had a meeting in Beijing, and according to Xinhua news agency, President Xi talked about building a framework for security, although this has not been widely reported in Japan. So I would like to ask Mr. Zhang Zushen what was on his mind, because it was hard for us to understand what President Xi was getting at. Please give us some context so that we can understand what what President Xi was talking about when he said there is a need to build a framework for security in East Asia.
I I just know Xi Jinping proposed, how to say, constructive security relationship with Japan. So I think it's a very good proposal, because we should think, what is a constructive security relationship? I think it should have at least 3 things. The first, we should always keep contacts and talks, no matter what kind of difference we have. So, but in the history, when we have a serious difference, if we have a crisis, the talks, and especially the top leaders meeting, stopped, stopped. It's not a constructive relationship. Secondly, is we must establish the crisis management mechanism. So we should learn the lesson from 2006 to 2009. So in that time, our relationship, China-Japan relations, has been improved a lot. But very soon, because of 2 crises, one is the boat collision, that is island purchase. So 2 countries' relations almost go to the military conflict, also between China and Japan, because of that issue. In 2005, very good relations, just like a honeymoon. But very soon, the relationship fell down to the bottom. So this is not a kind of a mature relationship. So if we have a constructive relationship, always keep talks, and we should have the capability of a crisis management and the difference management, and especially we can prevent the crisis prevention. And the third is we should try our best to cooperate with each other on the common interests. China, Japan, South Korea, and the USA, we have a lot of common interests. We are in the same boat when we meet in face of the non-traditional security challenge. And when we meet the challenge of the new strategic area, cybersecurity, outer space security. So a lot of things that we could join hands to do. So anyway, I think Xi Jinping proposed constructive security relationship with Japan. So this is my explanation. Yeah. But anyway, if in the future we can have regional architecture, joint architecture, we should also have this kind of constructive relationship. Also, maybe I think for several years, China has proposed the new security concept. So this is something we can also think about. That is mutual security, cooperative security, comprehensive security, and sustainable security. So this kind of new security concept should be the, I think, should be the concept of the regional architecture. So this is my understanding.
Thank you very much. Having listened to the comment right now, Mr. Masuda, so I also have a question to Mr. Nakatani. So after Mr. Masuda. So Mr. Masuda first. Thank you. My name is Masuda from NITS. Constructive security relationship to be built that was mentioned by Mr. Zhang Tuoshen. That was very positive. Now, it is not that on every point there is a problem, but when you say constructive relationship, what I presume what China is thinking, I believe you're thinking about institutionalization, how to make the crisis management mechanism to function well. But to be frank with you, since I specialize on research on China, that would be very difficult. So far, the Japanese side and US side, there have been professional debates being seen. And based upon that, for example, military to military contact, staff talks, if you can accumulate such efforts, then naturally there are shared standards being built between the 2 countries, and I believe that was the expectation. with China as well. But why is this not happening between Japan and China? What is necessary? Although I do not disagree with institutionalization, but at the same time, at the professional to professional basis, if something as a universal standard is being agreed and established, if we put that into a certain box, what comes out of the box may be very different. The mechanism for decision making or mechanism for policy making, that is what I'm talking about. When we institutionalize something, that would fix everything. That is not the case, because there are differences in systems, difference in institutional regimes between the two countries. And that is the reason why we need to keep constantly have study and research on each other. If not, then I don't think we will come close.
I have questions to my Chinese colleagues. What do you think about post-INF? Between USSR and the United States, they did away with mid-range missiles. But China overwhelmingly has missile warheads, and military might is strengthening in outer space as well on the part of China. If things go untouched, Japan and the United States will have to have missiles in order to counterweight China. So in terms of arms control or disarmament, aren't these things that China also needs to think about? Mid-range missile, we don't own, ROK doesn't own. So complete abolition of mid-range, intermediate-range missiles. If you could negotiate that with the United States, I think disarmament will progress. Is that possible? Who should we ask? Should we ask Jia Qingguo? Could you be brief? Or I think Jia Qingguo and can you also comment on whether there's a possibility to establish a multilateral framework in the missile context?
Well, the U.S. has withdrawn from a number of international agreements. INF is just one of them, and I think it poses a serious challenge to the region in terms of security. If the U.S. and Japan or South Korea install intermediate-range missiles, this would complicate the security situation. China certainly has a lot of missiles, but these missiles are supposed to address the challenge of a possible Taiwan independence. So they are very much defensive in nature in terms of national, core national interests of China, the territorial integrity issue. And I think ultimately, whether the military capabilities or military deployment of missiles, the most important thing is the nature of our relationship. Okay? If the relationship deteriorates to the extent that we are becoming adversaries, then any possession of any weapon, it poses a threat. But if the relationship is cooperative and regarded as, benign, then, the increase of defense spending and more weapons means more security, because you can ask them to live up so-called international responsibilities of maintaining peace in the region and also in other parts of the world. So it's a question of political relationship. I think what the most important thing in the region is how to re-establish a certain level of political trust and a certain level of goodwill. That's the most important thing. Thank you.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Lastly, no, sorry, we have some time. I have a question to General Lee San-chul. There has been many comments made by the other speakers, but thinking about peace in Northeast Asia, has there been any hints or clues in trying to suggest for this? What is your reaction? Do you have any comments? As many speakers have said, peace and a peaceful order to be created in Northeast Asia, the most important actors would be U.S. and China. Everyone have pointed to this. From strategic point of view, U.S. and China, if there is mistrust existing, what to do with this? How to change to a trust and confidence relationship? The rivalry needs to be transformed, and that would be the basis for peace in Northeast Asia. So we need to have closer contact and dialogue and cooperation to be made more active between U.S. and China, and that would contribute to the building of the peaceful order in Northeast Asia. So efforts must be exerted in this regard. And secondly, for peace and security to be established in Northeast Asia, the most sensitive area would be Korean Peninsula. As you know, the Korean Peninsula, back in 1950, there was the Korean the war, and that has not been actually completely been terminated. It is still ongoing in some way. And under such unstable situation that North Korea is ongoing for development of nuclear and missiles, there are direct security threat to not only ROK, but also to Japan and United States. So all the related countries must work together and exert efforts and cooperate with each other to bring solution to this matter. We should not just leave to the United States and North Korea. Even at the private sector level, we need to actively come forth with ideas to try to think about more creative ways and methods and try to approach and make proposal to governments. And at the government level as well, I hope that we will be able to see progress. And perhaps we need to have the private sector play a role of pump priming to urge and encourage government to move forward. Ultimately, the expectation and hope of the Republic of Korea people is the peaceful reunification will be realized in the Korean Peninsula, and peaceful order would be established on the peninsula so that we would be able to see very constructive progress forward. Thank you.
Soya-san, in 1 minute? Give me 2.5 minutes, please. This is relevant to what General Lee said. First of all, Ambassador David Shear encouraged us as scholars, to which I am extremely thankful. But this conference in itself can become such a venue. In other words, I'm just a non-government researcher who doesn't know what's ongoing in the government. So unlike the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff or Minister Nakatani, I'm not at the very center of defense dialogue. And of course, there's much to learn, but as Ambassador David Shear said, we may be able to cause good synergy. So what's the role as we non-government citizens can play in this context? One recent trend, especially typically in Japan ROC relationship, is when a G2G relationship becomes sour, both ROK and Japan's people's, general public's emotion get caught up. I wouldn't call it nationalism, but sometimes the government and the general public share the common frustration, and that trend is occurring both in Japan and ROC. But is this spreading to all citizens? Not necessarily the case. And that also becomes a deep divide within each of these two countries. So that's how difficult it is. So there is the G2G relationship, and in the case of US and China, by engaging military-to-military relationship, of course they are doing what they need to do, but I think we need to keep a distance from the G2G as non-G to non-G to come up with some measure. And I'm hopeful that this Asia Peace Conference will become such a venue. To give you a specific example as a food for thought for further study as one possibility for the future, that's the North Korean issue. In the morning's meeting, we did something like a reality check of what's occurring in the government sector. That was one idea which popped up. Can't we do that? So two things. Kim Jong-un, is he truly trying to cheat us and deceive us? I perceive that he's very serious about something. Then on what is he deeply serious? I think that's a subject that we need to analyze. The discussion tends to focus on the abolition of nuclear weapons, and that framework may not necessarily be right. Kim is very serious about something. That's why he traveled afar to Singapore. And another point, have we really been deceived? If we had been cheated, then we were unwise, so much so that we were deceived. Then we will have to become smarter. But have we really been deceived? That's a very important point. And 1949, and then KEDO was established, and KEDO was continued for a few years. And then came the Bush administration, and they said, we can't trust this. And then the U.S. began to break up that mechanism, and objectively, that was partly done by the U.S. Then came the six-party talks, and in 2006, until the first nuclear test by North Korea, from 1994 for more than 10 years, to a certain extent, things were controlled. So there was a time we didn't discuss North Korea's nuclear threat. And were we really defeated more than a decade? Not really. We weren't completely defeated. So what is Kim serious? Based upon that, some kind of mechanism of foreign policy. And maybe it's worth testing Kim Jong-un on some matter, but some kind of diplomatic effort to test his intention. We shouldn't be just giving up such a test just because we think that we'd again be cheated and deceived. And when we think about the North Korean issue, maybe we are best positioned as a non-government organization to test those things. So that was just one suggestion.
Thank you so much. We only have another 5 minutes. Mr. Paul, if no one else wants to speak, I would like to just ask this question to Doug. I mean, we have listened to different views. I mean, confrontation between United States and China, and this rivalry or confrontation, according to Professor Soya, we are losing sight of or have been betrayed. If we try to think of different issues only from the context of U.S.-China rivalry, then it's just a rivalry. But what is the situation that has been engendered by the confrontation? As a result of confrontation between U.S. and China, do we have better prospect for rule-based coexistence, or is there this confrontation for the purpose of, for the sake of confrontation? What is the situation? I would like to ask this question to Dr. Park.
In my judgment, the situation has deteriorated in U.S.-China relations far beyond what the objective circumstances demand. We've allowed our emotions and our fears to take us in directions that would not be, I think, viewed historically as wise. We've done that before, unfortunately. My view on U.S.-China competition is that it's going to be a big part of our future. There are differences in systems which make it harder to deal with China and the U.S. They have a hard time with our system. We have a hard time with their system. But diplomats and practical policy makers have to live with reality as it's delivered. And let's take some examples. The United States in the Obama administration took a hostile position towards the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I never understood why we did that. When Japan came up with the Asian Development Bank back in its earlier phase, of course, Japan was our ally and we were happy to support it. We did think of it as a challenge in those days. Asia has a need for infrastructure. We're not going to pay for it, and we no longer can build it. China is in a position to do that. Why should we not work with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? Now you fast forward to the Trump administration, and there's great suspicion about the Belt and Road Initiative. An Indian right-winger calls this a debt trap, and America immediately started repeating what this Indian anti-Chinese figure was saying without thinking through what is going on with the Belt and Road. Belt and Road actually could achieve some purposes that we share in common. Central Asia is a place that could produce a lot of terrorists if the people are not employed, if their economies are not stable, and if China can put facilities in Central Asia, why shouldn't we try to find a way to work with it? We're not going to compete. We're not going to build roads and harbors. That's something that we did 100 years ago. Japan did 50 years ago, Korea 30 years ago. Now it's China's turn. Why not work with them? The goal is, in many cases, I think, to co-opt, to find a way to work with and shape these new developments in Chinese policy that show that we appreciate the contribution they're making, but try to bring it within the value structure and the international order that will make these new features of Chinese behavior less disruptive to the existing system, but also be willing to adapt the existing system to bring China in, whether it's voting structure at the IMF or the World Bank, or how things operate at the UN, or contributions to peacekeeping forces. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Timekeeper is so appropriate. It is exactly 6 o'clock on the dot. So what we discussed today is thinking for the future to try to create a framework for the peace. As Mr. Choi Kon has said, what are the dreams that have been harbored by different people? I think we had some glimpse into this. What we need to think about, there are things that we need to consider. There could be a zone that we could find some common ground, especially Japan and U.S. should work together to try to enhance a deterrence. But our alliance is not for the offensive basis, but we will be able to create realistically a balance of power. But we need to have rules to be established as a starting point. We need to have a society where the rules are there, rules are in place. But having done so, we need to move on to the next stage, thinking about new dream. Of course, disarmament is also very important, as was suggested earlier. But we need to build confidence. We need to be thorough in trying to build confidence in many ways. And then gradually, we could turn to something that we can make into reality. Disarmament and arms control mechanism can be created. Then, Mr. Nakatani your dream could come true whilst you're still a politician yourself, then I would say that this was originally initiative taken by Mr. Nakatani. I would definitely say that. But 4 countries need to vigorously work closely together. Now, why was everyone talking so frankly and candidly? That is because for many, many years we have worked hard to create a good human relationship, people-to-people relationship, having dialogue many, many times. That was behind our conference today. So even though we are still beyond the end goal, we are still in the process of trying to reach the end goal, or we hope that we can move forward. I hope that people in the audience will work with us. We hope to move forward, definitely, to create a peaceful Northeast Asia. And I would like to continue to solicit your kind support. And for the panelists, thank you very much for remaining up until the end. Thank you very much for your input. Thank you. A big applause for all of them, please.